welcome Minister Smith, and I think it's very appropriate that today we've got Minister Nick Smith here. His background's amazingly relevant for the challenges, some of the challenges New Zealand's got at the moment. He's, I think, your PhD's in landslides, Minister, isn't it? Civil engineer, and the family, the broader Smith family, very heavily involved in the Christchurch rebuild with Smith's Cranes, you will have heard of, and I think two brothers in different businesses, isn't it? Five, yeah, two in New Zealand, a couple in Australia. So if you say that the Minister is highly connected to earthquakes, rebuild, landslides, earthquakes, and the environmental challenges and the land-based challenges that New Zealand has, you're a very appropriate first speaker this morning. Thank you, Minister.
Kia ora, and thank you for the privilege of being able to address the 42nd Annual Deer Industry Conference. Can I acknowledge Andy and Dan and pay tribute to the work that the Industry Association does. Can I also acknowledge the Parks family in my own home constituency in Nelson, who I think 25 years ago, Simon, gave me a lecture about the importance of the deer industry, the opportunities, and a real tribute to some of the pioneers who have created this new industry that it continues to make an important contribution to New Zealand. One of the risks in the Wellington scene for small businesses is that individually you're not that big in the economic scene. It's difficult to hear your voice. Collectively, actually, you're a $200 million a year industry. And the first message I'd give you this morning is how important it is when you've got policy debates occurring in Wellington that industries like your own gang up together and have a strong industry association that's able to ensure that your voice is heard in Wellington. The other big industry in my constituency in Nelson is fishing. There are basically three big fishing companies in New Zealand between Tally, Sanfords and Sealords. It's easy for them to get their voice heard in Wellington. They employ a PR consultant knocking on our doors all the time. If you don't collectively gather together, as much as it goes against the bone sometimes, of farmers that are highly independent, actually you need a strong industry association to make sure that your voice is heard in the policy development process in Wellington. Unkindly mentioned that when he introduced me about my dodgy Smith family that's involved in the construction industry and mentioned I've got a PhD in landslides, I remind myself when I arrived in Parliament 25 years ago, Sir Robert Muldoon was still there, and he said there's only two sorts of doctors in the world: the doctors that make you well and the doctors that make you sick. I hope this morning that I achieve the former, albeit I do know when a budget has just been released, and it is true that myself and Prime Minister Bill English entered Parliament together in 1990. And the part that I really felt in Parliament yesterday, listening to the budget, is how much New Zealand is in so much stronger financial position when I was privileged to first be elected as a Member of Parliament. You know, I remember in the 1990, New Zealand's level of debt was one of the worst in the OECD at about 93% of GDP. Today, it's 23%, less than Australia. We're at 23, Australia's at 26. You've got the US at 80, you've got the UK at 90, you've got the EU and the Greece out at 200-odd%. It actually matters, just like it does for your business, it matters for our government that we are in a strong financial position. And equally so, if I look at some of the core fundamentals of what makes an economy tick, whether it be in terms of interest rates, whether it be in terms of inflation levels, whether it be in terms of those very strong figures out this week on our product exports and our balance of payments. Everybody thought that when the dairy prices dropped that New Zealand would go doom and gloom on our balance of payments. Actually, don't underestimate the the diversity and the strength of New Zealanders to actually find new opportunities for export markets, and that's to be welcomed. And equally so when I look at our GDP figures. We're now in our sixth straight year of 3% growth, and the budget yesterday indicated another 4 years of strong growth projected into the future. Can't help but mention, obviously, the substantive decision by the government in yesterday's budget was to reduce taxes. And in the world of Wellington, there's almost an attitude that says that, the debate in Parliament both last night and this morning, is giving back people their own money is somehow seen as a bribe. Well, actually, and I come from a view that says government should only take the amount of money out of New Zealanders, businesses and workers' pockets that it needs to do the core government services. And certainly the philosophy that Stephen Joyce and Bill English has brought to the budget process is that we've got a duty to require the same discipline that you do in every day in your business about managing costs across the public sector. And actually, one of the best things that we can do for the economy is only take the amount of tax that we need to be able to do the core functions. Yes, we have got a strongly growing economy, and that's enabling us to be able to improve core services, whether they be health, whether they be education, whether they be police, whether they be ambulance officers, and a very key feature of the budget, and I will give you the numbers because actually if our economy is to continue to perform properly, one of our core responsibilities of government is to provide good infrastructure. If you take the previous government, they averaged spending $3 billion a year on infrastructure. Over our 8 years that we've been in government, we're averaging to spend $4 billion a year on infrastructure. In yesterday's budget, over the next 5 years, we're proposing to spend $8 billion a year on infrastructure in key things like whether it be ultra-fast broadband, whether it be roads, whether it be rail, whether it be those other core elements that only government can provide. Now, the key interaction between my portfolio as Environment Minister and your industry is around those environmental challenges. 20 years ago, I was part of establishing a Blue-Greens group within the National Party because actually the way in which we manage our natural resources has a bigger impact on our economy than any other OECD country. If you look at the core parts of the engine room of the New Zealand economy, they are all interacting with our natural environment, and it really matters. And so there's sort of three key components of National's view around managing the environment. The first is that a country needs to actually marry together its economic and environment policy in a rational and sensible way. That is, that those that pretend you can have a high quality environment without a strong economy are dreaming. And you just need to look around the world and see what are the basket cases in terms of their water quality or their air quality or other things. It is those that have failed economies. So you've got to work out how to do the two things together, and equally so, obviously, in whether it be our visitor industry, whether it be key food, quality products like your own, your velvet, other products, actually protecting New Zealand's clean green brand is an important part of what we can secure in product value. So how we do that stuff together. We're quite upfront. I have no ambition to outgreen the Green Party. What I do have an ambition is for New Zealand to be the best country in the world about how we integrate good economic and environment policy for delivering both a strong economy and a well-managed environment. The second core underlying element to our approach to environmental issues is that you need to base them on good science and technical data. That is, and I've been around environmental arguments for a long time, the capacity to get carried away with rhetoric and poor science has got the capacity to completely make a mess of the core decisions we need to make. So whether it comes to an issue like 1080, where I regularly have protests of people that say that it is damaging the brand or whatever, or whether it be our debate around how we're going to deal with issues like water quality, or even, dare I mention, a difficult argument like biotechnology and GM, my plea and National's view is that the safest place for us to make good decisions is to do so on the basis of good science. And then the third thing, of which I've had an ambition as Minister for the Environment to try and do, is to change the sort of political culture that operates around how we resolve these environmental issues. I remember back last decade, you had an organisation like Fish and Game running the Dirty Dairying campaign, and the President of Federated Farmers calling groups like them economic terrorists. And there was a whole lot of heat and not a hell of a lot of light. And actually, if we as New Zealanders are actually to resolve some of these environmental challenges, it needs to be done with mutual respect and actually people at both community and national level working together on the practical ways of which we can address the environmental challenges that our country faces. That is at the core of the reasons we set up the Land and Water Forum. It is why, for instance, I've recently established a collaborative forum around the question of biodiversity protection, where we have both farmers and environmental groups working together on the development of a national policy statement in that area. And there's a little bit of an underlying culture that flows from the Resource Management Act, and that is it tends to heavily polarise the environmental argument, so that you're either for the environment or for the economy, and actually it is by bringing those conversations together whether we're going to find the practical solutions that will work for New Zealand. Now, the biggest challenge on my plate is around freshwater, and I want to talk you through some of the issues there and the steps that we need to take as a country to lift our game. Firstly, and as I've said, we need to make the decisions on the basis of good science. What does the science tell us about the state of our waterways? Well, firstly, actually, New Zealand water quality by international comparison is good. Actually, we're out the top 25% of countries in the quality of our fresh water. Secondly, New Zealand is incredibly blessed with fresh water. These ideas that we've got a radical shortage of fresh water and those people that are putting in bottles and exporting it means that we're not going to have enough water to have a bath. Sorry, get a life. Because if we look at the amount of fresh water per person in New Zealand at 144 million litres per person, that's enough for every one of us to have a bath about every 7 seconds. If you compare it, there's only one other country that's got over 100 million litres of water per person. That's Iceland. It's a bit bloody cold there to grow much with it. If you look at comparative countries, like the UK's got 8, China's got 6, US has got about 12, and Australia's got about 30. New Zealand is incredibly blessed with freshwater resources, and currently New Zealand extracts about 2% of our total freshwater use for a range of uses, of which by far the greatest portion is for irrigation. New Zealand's water quantity issues are limited to quite specific areas at quite specific times of the year, and that's where we need to focus that particular debate. In respect of water quality, it is complicated. It's complicated because actually the issue of water quality is not just a single measure. There is the issue of pathogens, or how much crap there is in the river that poses a risk to human health. There's the issue of sediment that gets into our waterways, and how much that both decolours the waterways and also impacts on the ecological health of those that live in our waterways. And then there's the issue of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, that at elevated levels results in algae blooms that removes many of both the ecological, the recreational and the aesthetic values of our waterways. And actually, if you look across New Zealand, each of our waterways actually has different challenges. Some of them are challenged by nitrogen, some by phosphorus, some by E. coli, some by sediment. And so the idea that there's a single problem and a simple solution across New Zealand is not correct. If we are to get on top of our freshwater issues, the first thing we need to understand is the challenge for different water bodies varies. And then you ask the question, well, what about on the sort of the big picture? How are we doing, and what's the bits that worry me? Well, if I take the RMA since 1991, the truth is it has done a fantastic job of reducing point source pollution. If you're looking at any of our rivers and lakes and you look at the amount of pollutant that's going in as a consequence of meatworks, as a consequence of town sewage schemes, as a consequence of factories, scouring plants, all those things, there has been of the order of a 90% reduction in the amount of pollution coming out of a pipe going into our lakes and rivers over the last 25 years. So a big tick, and from a policy point of view, actually working pretty well. And even looking out into the future, I've got confidence in the system that the amount of point source pollution is going to continue to decline as those consents come up for renewal and those people are required to reduce the amount of pollutant going into our water bodies. But that's the good news. Let me give you the bad. The gains that we have made as a consequence of reducing the amount of point source pollution has over the last 25 years been overwhelmed by the far more challenging issue of diffuse pollution. That is the pollution that occurs to our waterways as a consequence of whether it be in town, cat poo, whether it be in terms of the issue of toxic chemicals that would come out of our fuel and the tyres and the brakes of our cars in urban areas, or in rural areas in respect of the diffuse pollution that comes from farm animals and their excretions, whether it be in terms of fertiliser and those, and the increased flow of sediment. That's the bit that's not working. That is the bit that we have to find a solution to. Now, when I came into this job, I was aware of that. I thought there'd be some country in the world that's got this cracked, and I'd be able to go to Europe or North America or somewhere and find someone that's got a model or a policy option that would make it easy to be able to try and resolve these diffuse pollution issues. The reality is actually New Zealand is at the cutting edge of steps to improve and reduce these very complex diffuse pollution issues. If you look at that scheme that we have set up in Lake Taupo to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's getting into that, our largest lake, it is a world-leading scheme that is recognised and been actually received awards in different corners of the world for the innovation and the new approach that's being adopted. Now, in terms of the rural-urban balance, let me tell you, actually, water quality in our urban areas is on average worse than what it is in our rural areas. I'll give you the numbers. They're produced independently by the Department of Statistics. If you take an issue like E. coli that's particularly pertinent and being debated at the moment, the average level of E. coli in an urban stream in New Zealand is 440 E. coli per 100 mils. The average level in our pastoral farming environment is 180. The average level in an exotic plantation across New Zealand is about 50, and in our indigenous forests is about 20. So in terms of where do farmers sit, actually, not as bad. But here's the other part and the balancing part of the picture. The rural pastoral area is 10 times bigger than the urban area, miles bigger. So in terms of improving freshwater quality and the problem of deterioration as a consequence of an increased intensification over the last 25 years, actually, at a New Zealand-wide level, the main gain is in terms of the farming community, but the urban community needs to do their share of the heavy lifting. Now, inside the water debate, there's another aspect, and that is how much should be being done nationally, at a national level by my ministry and directed from Parliament, and how much should you be leaving to your local regional council to sort out the rules and the response? There is not a complete magic answer to that. My very first job as a graduating civil engineer was with the National Water and Soil Conservation Authority, of which a few grey hairs in the room may remember. It is my view that in the big reform that occurred during the 1980s, government effectively passed the water management problem to regional councils and provided no direction, and that has been a weakness, and that is something that we have attempted to address. First step was in terms of providing for a national policy statement in 2010, and then with the hard work, and I give absolute tribute to the way in which deer farmers have contributed alongside others in the rural community through the Land and Water Forum to the National Objectives Framework, which has set national limits that we need to apply across the country around everything from nutrients to pathogens and others. And at the moment, we have got a process across the country where regional councils are seeking to implement those limits. It is not without difficulty. I remember in 2009 being told by one of, Bill English's sisters, that the day that the government came along and told them how many bloody stock they could have on their farm was the day I was going to get the arse. If you are going to deal with diffuse pollution, it is going to mean that you are going to have to put some limits on the stocking rates if, through tools like Overseer, we are to get on top of some of those nutrient issues in particular catchments. And across the country, we have now got over 20 catchments where those sorts of limits have been put in place, and they are going to be needed if we're going to overcome these problems. The latest chapter in our work is the clean water package that I released with Prime Minister English earlier this year. What is tackled in that particular package is the issue of the swimmability of our waterways. Now, there's been a bit of argy-bargy about where we set those levels of E. coli in our waterways, because I think it is the ambition of New Zealanders that as much as practically possible, we are able to go for a swim in our substantive rivers or lakes. And for the very first time, we have published maps consistently across the whole country giving a perspective of those E. coli levels and the frequency with which they are swimmable. 3 weeks ago, I released a report from NIWA that reinforced, because a few greenies had been challenging them, the categories that we've set up. So every waterway that's more than 400 millimetres or 40 centimetres deep across the country has now been graduated from an excellent, a good, a fair, an intermittent and a poor category. Across the country, on the basis of that data, currently we have 72% of our waterways are in those fair, good or excellent categories, and we've set a target that by 2030 we bump that up to 80%, and that by 2040 we get that up to 90%. Now, in terms of the debate about whether those categories are fair, that NIWA report said that the excellent category we have chosen is basically identical to the Europeans and the only ones in the world that have attempted to provide a graduated system around this issue of freshwater quality for swimmability. Secondly, the fair category that I've set in New Zealand is slightly tougher than what the Europeans have, but in my view is pretty robust. Having targets, having clear maps about the state of our waterways, then gets into the exercise of, well, how are we going to achieve that? And that comes to me to one of the biggest environmental challenges for the deer farming industry, and that is the fencing of stock from waterways. Through the Land and Water Forum and through the Resource Management Amendment Bill that was passed through Parliament in April, I am developing national regulations with the graduated requirements for our waterways across New Zealand to have stock excluded from them. I want to commend the work of the Land and Water Forum and the engagement of both your organisation and Federated Farmers to ensuring that those measures are reasonably practical. That is, that the timetable is varied as to the type of farming. We've been toughest on the dairy sector. We've been softest on sectors like deer and cattle that tend to be in steeper and more difficult country. There are pragmatic exemptions proposed in those rules because sometimes, and particularly in some of the tiger country in which you operate your farming businesses, you've got more chance of getting the moon than getting a robust fence to be able to keep stock out of waterways. And that's fair and that's realistic. But you should be in no doubt that of all the things that the farming community can do to make a material difference at reasonable cost around the issue of water quality, is the progressive fencing of waterways is one of the least expensive and most important things that we need to do. So that plan sets out our requirements with full implementation by 2030. And I can tell you from looking at the E. coli data and the sediment data in many parts of New Zealand, where fencing has been done, it is remarkable the gains that we're able to achieve actually more quickly than many of our water quality scientists thought were possible. So I seek your engagement and will be sharing with the Deer Farmers Association and the broader community the detail of those regulations as they are drafted by Parliamentary Council, and it is our intention to have those national regulations in place. There has been a debate about the issue of riparian planting. There is no question that the riparian planting adjacent to our stock exclusion can make a material further difference, benefiting both water quality and also biodiversity and other environmental issues in rural New Zealand. The difficulty is that the riparian planting and approach in Southland, the Mackenzie country, whether it be in the far north, the east coast or the west coast of the south, varies significantly, and I'm hesitant to nationally regulate the issue of riparian planting, because actually if you're going to do it sensibly, you will do it quite differently in various parts of the country. Deer farmers do need to be engaged with their regional council about what can practically be done around that riparian planting so it supports the gains that we're seeking to achieve through those fencing regs. The last point I'd make in the issue and the debate around freshwater quality is, if you ask me where the sharp end of the political argument is going to be in the election in 3 months' time, is that there are a bunch of political parties that saying New Zealand has a binary choice. We either have clean water or we have economic growth. You can't have both. You can't grow primary industry and also improve fresh water. I say bunkum. I say that it is perfectly possible with well-designed water storage schemes, good management practice on farms, for us to be able to grow industries like your own and also to improve the quality of our fresh water. I give a simple example in my own Nelson area, where a dedicated bunch have developed the proposals for the Waimea Dam. And yes, it will involve the irrigation of about an extra 4,000 hectares of land on the Waimea Plains. As a consequence of having water storage, we're going to be able to lift the minimum flows in the Waimea River such that the algae blooms that we've got in the lower reaches very regularly over the last 25 years would no longer exist. We'd also have the capacity to be able to provide flushing flows, so that if those algae start to build up, we're able to provide a flow that reduces it. And the other factor that many people don't realise is that on much of the Waimea Plains, where there has been no further water permits issued now for 20 years, in converting some of the very low density pastoral farming over to crops like apples or hops or grapes, actually the amount of nutrient also reduces, and people make the simplistic judgment that any form of intensification automatically results in increased nutrients, and that is not true. And so my view is actually the option of well-designed, well-regulated water augmentation schemes are actually part of the solution, not part of the problem for New Zealand around this wider debate in how we manage that precious water resource. Again, I want to conclude by saying your association has been intricately engaged in this issue of fresh water. Sometimes I've run into farmers who said, what's the point of engaging when no matter what we do, there will be those green groups that want to throw stones and undermine the substantive efforts that farmers have been making to improve the environmental impacts. My response to that, actually, is that this picture is bigger than a few Greenpeace protesters on the edge. Actually, this is an issue about New Zealand, and certainly our government believes that actually it is by farmers stepping up to the plate in a practical way and being part of the solution that means that New Zealanders actually stand up. And I leave with a little political story, and that is that I remember back in 2008 a rather cynical discussion from the government of the time that said that they did not give a hoot about what a few pastoral farmers might be pissed off with the government over a pretty aggressive and, in my view, un-New Zealand approach to those very small number of high country farmers. And the political masters of the day made the assumption that there were so few of those high country farmers that it didn't matter how badly the government screwed them, it wasn't going to cost them any votes. And what surprised me as a constituency MP representing actually a pretty green electorate was the number of people who said to me had no interest at all in those high country farmers, but rejected that government because they were being unfair on a group of pioneering New Zealanders, and it felt like an attack on those basic Kiwi values. Do not underestimate the degree to which there is a deep-seated respect, even amongst urban New Zealanders, for the contribution and the hard yards that the farming community makes for New Zealand. And that is why, don't be defensive, be engaged, and working together, we can get on top of these environmental issues and have a strong, well-managed economy and an environment of which we all can be proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that very clear and concise view. And I'd like you to be in no doubt how the farmers in this industry feel about being proactive and ahead of the game. And I'm just looking at the time. We might have time for a couple of questions, Minister, if you're able to. Yes.
Nick.
Thank you, Chairman and Minister. May I congratulate you on your address in the subject of water quality. We've been fortunate with the Apua Dam for 20 years to see the benefits and so forth, exactly as you outlined. Also, as farmers, we congratulate the government on a science argument, on an effects argument, to take the solutions further forward for us. Also for the moving to the swimmability rather than wadeability. I sense you almost could have lost the election over such a small point as that, but swimmability is so important to the Kiwi thing. And look, the one tool that there is out there which certainly would help our argument on farm is the science behind a nitrate test in our own streams and waterways and wells and so forth. We understand it's being developed and will be commercially available, but if the government can facilitate the speed of that and the quality of that and the cost to us, for us to individually own such a technique, we could really stand up in the community and go forward with our own decisions. Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, take on board the message. The part that makes the E. coli pathogen argument easier is because that testing is relatively inexpensive. You're absolutely right around trying to measure nitrate levels and is far more currently dependent on models like Overseer than it is on actual measurements. We are, and in yesterday's budget, we have increased New Zealand's investments in the sciences by a bit over 120 million. In our national science challenges, the whole land and water interaction is there. We do need to be able to improve the tools. From what I have read, my view, it is going to be quite a tough stretch for scientists to develop a easy, farmer-friendly, inexpensive tools for measuring nitrogen, but it would make a hell of a difference if we could crack that nut and take on board your message.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions?
Yeah, just quickly. Minister Smith, in Marlborough, our local council, they had a Canadian water test. Now, we had about 8 industry experts, and they'd never heard of this. And we were told that this test is well known, it's national, yet these 8 experts had never heard of it. So I just wondered, is there a national test for water quality, and why isn't our council using it?
Yeah. As I sort of said in my presentation, and I actually do give tribute to Dr. Jan Wright, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, about 12 months ago, produced a report on water quality, which wasn't giving any recommendations, but just giving a description. And I really would encourage people, particularly those of you that are farmers that are engaging with this issue, to get a read of it. I tell you why. What it very clearly explains is that there isn't going to be a single measure for water quality, because you've got your ecological health, and you've got the MCI that measures that. You've got your E. coli levels, and there are good measures for that. You've got your measures of the levels of nutrients, and you've got measures of the level of sediment. And the idea that you can somehow mesh all those four measures all into one is not possible. And you need to understand for your particular water bodies what are your water quality challenges. Because I tell you, they vary very significantly across New Zealand. And the measures that you'll want to take if you've got a particular problem with nutrients is quite different to the sorts of issues you would take if your particular problem is around pathogens or others. So reading that report will actually help inform communities and actually help some of the pushback with urban New Zealanders who don't have their head around the complexity of the water quality challenge, and that doesn't help us get to a solution.
Okay, I think we've got a question down the back, have we?
Yes, Minister Smith. Congratulations on that presentation today. I, as a farmer and a representative of this industry, are going through a very difficult time in the Waikato, as you're probably aware, with PC1 going through to PC10 or wherever it's going to end up. There seems to be a disconnect between council and government over guidelines on regional plans. Our plan lacks science. It lacks all the things you talked about today here. I just wonder whether we could get a copy of this presentation and send it to our regional councils to start acting responsibly and back to the people that they're supposed to be representing.
Yeah, well,
sorry, sir.
Yeah.
The national standards have to go through to these regional councils.
Yes.
They just have to. And I agree with you, parts in your speech that say that each river's got to be treated different. Each farm is a different kettle of fish than the one next door. But these councils just seem that one rule fits all. And every part of their plan lacks the science and the support that it needs to get farmers on board. I just wonder if you could just have a little chat to some of these people. It would be appreciated. Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, sure. The first bit is, look, it's a hell of a tough job that the regional councils have in implementing the limits around nutrients. I tell you, it's really hard. And what's really hard about it is that if you take a catchment like the Waikato, and I'm very familiar with the sort of political tensions in that part of the world as they try and impose limits, here's the bit that's really difficult. You've got some dairy farmers in the Waikato that in good faith have invested millions and millions of dollars in the development of their dairy farms. And the reality is that their per hectare nitrogen leach is miles higher than that from many pastoral farmers. And so the really tough job that the Waikato Regional Council and systematically every regional council in New Zealand has got is if you're going to limit the amount of nitrogen in that catchment that gets into the river and our waterways, how do you deal with the very wide variation in leaching rates on different farms? And there's a big argument that goes on about whether you should, for instance, just allocate, say, right, the amount is X number of kilograms of nitrogen per hectare across the whole catchment. You could do that. That would completely screw the dairy farmers who have got no way of realistically getting back to those levels that would be required for sustainability. And you've got other farmers who have not intensified, whose nitrogen leachate levels are far lower, who are now in an area like the Waikato facing limits on the degree to which they can intensify, and that flows through to their land values and the values of their most important asset. So while, yes, take an issue like fencing and stock exclusion, we're going to regulate that nationwide because we don't think it's worthwhile having the argument 16 times over across the whole country. But I do have some sympathy for the regional councils because in that dilemma about to what degree do you grandparent and what degree do you Otherwise, allocate that nitrogen is hellishly difficult. The last bit I'd add to that discussion is I have a technical advisory group that's going to be reporting back at the end of the year about how they might do those allocations. It's going to require the wisdom of Solomon. It is very, very difficult. It will help regional councils through those issues, but I've got to be honest with you and tell you it is still going to be bloody difficult.
Minister, if we just finish before you present the Elworthy Award with a glass half full scenario, some of the stuff that I'm seeing would suggest from a lead indicator point of view that we're making a huge amount of progress. And some of the science that's coming out and the progress that individual farmers are making, and indeed regional councils are making with planning in some areas, but it's extremely variable. On the other hand, the lag indicators are still not looking that flash, and that's what the environmental lobby keep promulgating. How do you think we should better promote the lead indicators as evidence of progress rather than having to continually defend the lag indicators?
Yeah. Firstly, we need to be upfront with both our community, including industries like your own, that this challenge around water quality is a long haul. Anybody who pretends that you're going to fix it all in 5 years, I'm sorry, it's just simply incorrect. I'll just give you a really good practical example. In my community in Nelson, we had a major pig farming operation out on the Waimea Plains. It operated through the 1950s, 60s. It shut down in the mid-1970s. It's left a plume of nitrogen that's moving slowly down the Waimea Plains. We've just had to spend $13 million in Richmond to treat the water to ensure that we don't have excessive nitrogen levels in the town water supply for Richmond. Now, nothing we do for the next 20 years is going to make any difference to that plume of nitrogen moving down. And people are looking for the sort of instant sort of results. And so that's where I come back to the view of having that honest conversation about both the progress that is being made, but this is a big long haul picture. There are issues of water quality in many of our water bodies, go back 80 or 100 years, and it is going to be that sort of generational benefit or length of time before we are going to be able to see the full length of benefit across New Zealand. And the reason we need to be open about the size of that challenge and the time take to fix it is otherwise we'll just keep getting disappointed. Farmers will do the effort, there'll be change, there'll be investment, and people say, oh, well, it's still getting worse. Well, that is where science is important. I'm very proud of the Environment Reporting Act that we put through Parliament. The reason for that is so that independent of government of the day, on a nationwide basis, you've got good independent information about the quality of our waterways of which the community can make judgments about. Last point, my view is that farmers are doing a hell of a lot of stuff in this space. We have got a job both as government and as industries to communicate to wider New Zealanders the progress that we're making, whether it be the huge improvements in Lake Rotoiti, Lake Brunner down on the coast, whether it be Lake Taupo. Actually, every time we get results that are showing improvement and there is investment, we need to be able to tell that story to protect the important brand of industries like New Zealand's dairy industry. Thank you again.
Thank you. So we have one final thing for you to do. So Peter Elworthy was a leader of agriculture in New Zealand and a leader in the dairy industry, and he led both on a production point of view, a political point of view, and the environmental point of view, which is why the Sir Peter Elworthy Award is, and not forgetting Lady Fiona, this award remembers their efforts in that regard. So you've got a very important job this morning to present the winner of this year's Environmental Award.
How appropriate to celebrate excellence when we've just speaking of the importance of telling the story of those that are making the extra effort. Would like to invite Bob Sharp, Steve and Chris Borland to come forward to receive the Elworthy Environmental Award Premier winner for 2017.
Thank you for your time with us this morning, Minister. You're welcome to stay as long as you want, but we know you have other commitments. So back to the budget debate. Good luck. Thank you.